Good evening. I'm Jane Andrews with the League of Women Voters of San Diego. Thank you for joining us. If there are any elected officials or candidates in attendance today, we'd like to acknowledge you. So please send us a chat message with your title or office. We are using Zoom webinar for this event, so attendees will not appear on audio or video. Closed captions and a live transcript are available. Click the button in Zoom that says CC Live Transcript and select Show Captions or View Full Transcript. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A button to submit your question. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our website tomorrow. Now, I would like to introduce Karen Sutton, President of the League of Women Voters of North County, San Diego.
Thank you, Jane. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the members of the Event Committee and the Criminal Justice Committee for their efforts in arranging tonight's program. There are also several upcoming meetings that I'd like to bring to your attention. On Wednesday, April 13th at 7 p.m., both leagues will be hosting a candidate forum for San Diego County Sheriff candidates. And on Thursday, April 14th at 5:30, the Policing San Diego Study Report and Consensus meeting will be held via Zoom. Information and registration links for both programs can be found on the league's websites. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'll now turn the meeting over to Jeannie Brown, past San Diego League President and current Chair of the Criminal Justice Committee. Jeannie?
Good evening. For this study, the policing practices in San Diego County, we've chosen 5 topics of concern. Tonight, we're focusing on surveillance. Surveillance has slowly been increasing as technology has increased. But as surveillance increased, oversight has not. Tonight, we hope that by understanding what technology is being used in our communities and how it can affect our personal privacy, we will be better prepared to know what safeguards are needed. Our 2 speakers have a remarkable background in technology and privacy. They met when they were both working for Facebook. Maritiza Johnson is now at the University of San Diego as the founding director of the Center for Civil Digital Society and a partner at Good Research. Jessica Traynor is the director of Good Research's newly created Good Impact program, which develops programs to build better knowledge around data and privacy. The format tonight will be a planned interview with time for Q&A after. Ladies, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jeannie, Karen, Jane. It's so great to be here. We're really excited. So we're each going to give a little bit more background on why we're in this space, why we care about it, what we're working on, and then we'll dive into the questions. So I've been working at the intersection of technology and philanthropy a really long time. And this has included a lot of fundraising, grant making. I ran a family foundation. I've started a few nonprofits. I even acquired one. Most recently, I've been consulting with executive directors and their boards on nonprofits. So it's in my blood. My dad was a public middle school teacher for decades. My mom was a social worker. I grew up in South Florida, very far and more humid than San Diego, but we had similar challenges. So many years ago, I was fundraising in the Bay Area, and frankly, I became charmed by these young, super smart guys, and yes, they were guys, and their idealism and their enthusiasm was contagious. One of the donors I was working with was an early Facebook employee, and I got a job at Facebook. My job was to build relationships between universities and Facebook. And we did this by making grants and setting up research collaborations. And we were interested in discovery. This is the largest social network of our time we were building. Let's learn from it. Let's help people with it. And that sounds great. But quickly I started asking questions. And the more questions I asked, the more buried I was in the organization, the more they took away from me. And I left. I swore off for-profits, but I didn't swear off tech because I still believed in the power and the promise of technology. And I was working with some people, some few, that also believed and also were questioning things. And one of them was my friend and colleague, Maritiza Johnson.
Thanks, Jessica. So hi, everyone. I'm Maritiza Johnson. I'm a data privacy expert. I'm a technologist by training. And for the past 15 years, I've been working to better understand how we as technologists can design products and services that are safe for people and society, particularly from a security and privacy point of view. So I discovered computer science as a freshman at University of San Diego. And I actually distinctly remember being completely baffled by my first programming class. I couldn't make heads or tails of the material. And it had actually never occurred to me before that computers were programmed by people. I think I kind of saw engineering as a very technical pursuit, and it was not a thing that people did, which now in hindsight is silly because the entire enterprise, it's people all the way down, people building for people. At the time, I loved the neatness of it. I loved the problem solving, and I also loved the challenges that it presented and the exciting possibilities that it opened. So it was in the early 2000s, and at the time, really, I was just eager to find a way into a good paying job. So I went on to do a PhD at Columbia. And since then, I've worked at some of the biggest tech companies, advising on data strategy, reviewing products, building products, and also researching new tools. So I've been at Google, Facebook, Microsoft, IBM, AT&T. I've worked with Cisco. And after many years in New York and at Silicon Valley, I'm now back at USD, and I'm leading a new center that's aimed at rethinking our relationship with data and technology. So coming back to my hometown, wearing my professional hat, I was both surprised and, to be honest, more than a little bit alarmed to see the headlines about my hometown's eager embrace of smart city technology and surveillance equipment without paying quite so much attention, the due attention that was needed to putting in effective frameworks to be sure that we had transparency, oversight, and accountability. At the same time, I've also been massively heartened to see the grassroots groups of concerned residents that are hard at work, pushing for new ordinances and change. Some of you might have seen that just yesterday, City Council pushed forward yet additional movement on embracing the privacy ordinance. They'll be working toward establishing the Privacy Oversight Board. And really, it's so exciting. So I think this panel couldn't be held at a better time. It's a great week to be talking data privacy and surveillance. And really, I'm always excited to talk about technology and data, but I'm particularly jazzed about being here today.
All right, so Maritiza and I, like Jeannie said, we're going to talk about data and technology. We're going to talk about what's going on in San Diego, and we're going to talk about my favorite, what can we do about it? And I think that to start, Maritiza, you said a few things in there that were interesting. And one thing I wanted to point out to everyone here tonight, or it's nighttime for me, is that Maritiza is very unique among computer scientists and as a technologist. I've worked with many over the years, and I'm sure many of you have come across some, in that she actually cares about the user. Not just cares in like oh, I care, but in everything she builds. So what I think this rare combination of speaking tech and human, you offer a unique perspective. Can you talk a little bit more about how and what you mean by our relationship with data?
Yeah, so in one of my roles, in much of my work, I've worked as a user experience researcher at tech companies and also as a privacy manager. So part of this work means that I've spent a good amount of time talking with a range of audiences about data privacy and all aspects of the data lifecycle. And one thing that's really interesting that keeps these conversations going is that there's this almost undeniable sense that there's a lot of exciting promise in the possibilities for tech and innovation. And I think sometimes we get swept away with them and then forget to ask the critical questions about what it means and what are the implications. So this vast amount of data that's available, the processing power and the storage, it's had an enormous upside. And at the same time, as the conversation gets going, a lot of us, I think, have niggling doubts. We wonder about what it means for us as individuals. We wonder about what it means for us as society. And I've seen a range of emotions in these conversations. So that could range from indifference. It could range to shame for feeling like you're not doing enough, like you don't know enough. Sometimes it's anger that it doesn't quite work the way you'd expect it to, frustration that you feel like you don't have a voice, Some folks I think are daring. They're daring in their adoption of technology and almost in like a show me that anything wrong could possibly happen sort of vibe, or even superiority. Those bad things won't happen to me. And one source I think of those feelings is that as individuals, it feels, and it's I think a warranted feeling that we don't have much power over how our data is collected and used. And that feeling of power, I think, can lead us to all sorts of different directions, all the different ones I mentioned. So I think we're in a situation right now where, as users, our needs and concerns have been ignored, and it leaves us with a burden of scrambling around, trying to figure out how do we manage our personal data? How do we figure out what's going on? How do we, tinker with all those settings to get it just right for us? And we don't really have enough knowledge or support to do it effectively, to do it well. And so, I feel like right now as individuals, we're put in a place where in the absence of knowledge, in the absence of support, we have to put a lot of trust in the organizations and the companies that are collecting and using our data. We're asked to, at times, kind of blindly give that trust without necessarily a lot of evidence of why we should do it. And I feel like that's where I want to redefine our relationship. So if we think about a relationship, it's ongoing. We kind of have an idea of what our expectations are. We have an idea of what would make us satisfied. And with data, because it is so inherently tied with us as individuals, it's inherently tied to our places in society and how we interact with it. I don't think it's enough for companies to kind of collect all of our data and use it without being upfront about what their relationship is and what their commitments are to protecting our data and using it safely. So I would really love to see us in a situation where the companies that are using our data are on the hook for making commitments about how they collect and use it, that they're being held accountable to honor those commitments, and also that we have actual transparency in terms of having them actually like show us the receipts. Like, how do we know that they're using our data and protecting it in the way that we expect? And if you think about those expectations, I don't think that they're they're not too far fetched. Yet at the same time, we don't really get that right now. So I think to me, when we start talking about redefining our relationship with data, it's really about moving from what we have today, where it's based on blind trust, one directional communication. It feels very dysfunctional. And then, you think about what it could be instead, and it could be informed, we could be empowered, we could, have more knowledge about how our data is being used.
All right, but you say knowledge. All right, knowledge is big. All right.
Mm-hmm.
When you said yourself, like when you were starting computer science, like there's a lot to learn. Like how much of this, technology, broadly speaking, and how our data is used, how much of the nuts and bolts of the sausage do we really need to know?
That's such a great question. So if you take one thing away from this seminar, what I want you to take away is that you don't need deep technical expertise to ask questions or to have a view on what's acceptable in terms of use of technology. And, I think that, and we'll get into this more in the various questions and answers, it's reasonable that we would expect that we have standards that are set forth without necessarily having to understand what are the details that an organization or the technology would implement in order to be sure those standards are met. So it feels like a lot of today's amazing technology almost has a bit of like a magical aura to it. And I think as long as regulating the use of data remains behind kind of that mystique of technological advances, we'll all remain feeling these sort of feelings of disempowerment. And I think that's where talks like this, we can start to address that and start chipping away at it. So again, you don't need to know that much really. And there are a few things that are useful to know that could help you begin to ask open-ended questions to kind of crack open the space and to feel like you have a bit of a foundation to ask questions. So some of it could be keeping up on the headlines about the mistakes or misuses, the missteps that technology companies have already faced, or that the adoption of technology has faced. And I also want to talk a little bit about sort of a broad model that could help you open up a place for you to start asking questions about data collection and use. and we call it the data life cycle. So if you think about, so it's kind of interesting. Our data and the use of technology really does have a bit of a life cycle. So from data pursuit, this would be kind of like the beginning of that, up until data deletion, there are several intermediate steps by which technology is making, like putting that data to use. And for the companies that are building technology, the people that work within them are making decisions about how they build the technology that would impact how we think about it, and will also impact the broader implications of what's going on. So when we talk about data pursuit, these are the decisions about, what data is it that we're collecting? Why are we collecting it? How will we collect it? What do the different variables mean? You think about kind of going from like the real natural world into a representation that you would have within the computer. And this is kind of like in the strategizing phase. So when you're figuring out how to build your product, you're thinking, how are we going to pursue the data? Then there's a stage where that data is actually acquired. So you go about gathering the data, and then it's, sort of in the system. And there are questions that you might have there where you're wondering about, well, how is it collected? What are the sensors? So sometimes this is from a video camera, sometimes it's from a microphone, sometimes it's like our little smartphones have a lot of interesting sensors that allow us to type into them and get various things into the system. And basically for any parts of that, you could have questions about what data is collected, what does it represent, what are the ideas of meaning for that, how is it protected? So once the data is actually collected by the system, how is it used? We want to think about data processing, data storage. How is it being manipulated into figuring out what does that mean for the situation? And data protection. So basically, like, it's not just a matter of taking a device and putting it in an environment. There's a whole kind of stretch of like real estate in there where you can start asking different questions, and you might have different expectations and needs depending on how it's being used.
Okay, so we don't have to know a lot. We have to know what kind of questions to ask. You said something in there, you said putting the data to use. Like, don't we get some good stuff out of this? Like, we get free email, we get free Google Docs, we get like free Zoom, we get free lots of stuff, but we pay for it with our data, not with money. So so why is this a problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I feel like in the past couple of years, free has kind of become a bit of a curious concept in the software industry. So there's a joke about free software, and it's, all right, when you say free, do you mean free as in speech? Do you mean free as in beer? Or do you mean free as in puppy? And when I say that we carry a burden, I mean that a lot of our free services are free as in puppy. So we enjoy the upside, there are a lot of benefits, but at the same time, we have, maintenance costs and other costs associated with the use of it. So a lot of today's most popular internet services, they're free in the sense that you don't directly pay money for them, but the organizations that provide the services, they've found a way to pay their bills somehow. So paying software engineers and other employees, running data centers, it's quite expensive. It's not free. And advertising is what makes a lot of this possible. And so lately there's been quite a lot of discourse around the rise of surveillance technology and a bit of like a surveillance ecosystem that is funding our free services. And one thing that's interesting about the rise of those economics is that online advertising today it's completely unlike putting an ad in the local paper as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. There's the whole setup is built around being able to target ads in a very specific way, being able to measure what's effective, and really figuring out different ways to pursue data, collect it, use it, transform it in ways that are kind of proving out the ways that online advertising is effective without necessarily bringing a lot of value to us. I feel like one of the sayings that I've kind of clung to in my career has been, if they build it, they will come. If you build it, they will come. So one of the things with kind of relying on the like heavily datafied version of advertising is that the companies involved in the ecosystem are collecting huge amounts of data. And if you think back to 2013, when the Snowden revelations were hitting the headlines, there were a lot of questions about whether or not big tech companies were collaborating with the US government to aid in surveillance and to share our data with different intelligence agencies. And it turned out that it wasn't the fact that companies were deliberately agreeing to share the data. It's that based on the way that things were built, the intelligence agencies were able to kind of piggyback off of what was being collected. And so like this has been sort of an interesting theme that comes up with technology and data, from data pursuit to data deletion. If things aren't adequately protected, before you know it, the secondary uses lead to adverse events that weren't planned on. And if you're not protecting to be sure that that's not happening, you can't really make any guarantees or promises about what's going on. So going back a little bit, this idea of like, but don't we benefit from what's free, and don't we benefit from technological innovation? And I would say, one of the things that's interesting in the way that our technologies are built and sold, because we're not paying for them directly, the companies that are building it, they always have an idea of who the primary stakeholder is. They know who's going to pay for the service, and they know kind of who has the purchasing power. So to give an example, at USD, I teach a class in ethical considerations for the building of artificial intelligence. And in it, we look at existing companies that are offering and building AI-enabled technology. And this is for like a broad swath of end user technologies. Some of them are surveillance equipment, and some of them are other tech. And in it, I asked them to look at the company's marketing material. So I feel like at times the companies will put out material and white papers that are aimed at different audiences. And this is like one of the tools that journalists use to figure out what data is being collected, how is it used, and what are sort of some of these hidden features that you might not know depending on which audience you're actually in. And I think it's kind of curious that, for example, like to most people, you look at Facebook and you say, oh, Facebook's a social network. But then if you look at how they make their money, Facebook's not a social network, they're an advertising company. And that duality it's hard to reconcile. It's based off of their bottom line. It's clear who their actual customers are and what their priorities are. And yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that. So maybe like the kind of wrap it up sentence on that is just that when you're in technical development, priorities matter, and when you're making decisions based off stakeholders, those choices have
Okay, so
implications.
you're talking a lot about like companies and what and how companies use our data. What about how do elected officials then? Or you answered before about okay, users, regular people like us, like we don't need to know a lot of technical details. But what about people in government that are making the decisions about procuring and deploying technology? They need to know this tech.
Yeah, it's a great follow-up question. And I would say, really, to be honest, I don't think that elected officials need to have the level of knowledge that most people assume. So our modern lives have us interacting with many highly complex systems of interrelated parts. And putting pressure on a single person to be an expert at all levels within these different complex systems, I feel like that's just a way to stall satisfactory progress on the matter. So if we think of other domains where safety is a high priority, if we think about automobile safety standards, if we think about food safety, air travel, vaccine safety, water safety, these sectors are hugely important to society and to our lives. And we've figured out ways to approach a risk assessment and the management of the processes to proceed with varying levels of safety that match the context of use. And I feel like that's really missing right now in technology. We need to find a way to get to that level of maturity, especially when we start to think about technology that is deployed by our government in public spaces.
I remember many months ago, or maybe it was years ago, I don't know, when I had asked you, like, oh, the people making the decisions and the regulations here, they don't understand tech. None of them have worked even in Silicon Valley. And you said, that's a cop out. You got really upset.
Yeah.
All right. So knowing that government and all levels, they are procuring and deploying technology. So like how does this then like manifest in real life? This and also to our, I didn't add this in before, but the knowledge and agency piece. Okay, so we don't all need to know all the technical details. We need to know what questions to ask. And this is a good transition to talking specifically about San Diego.
Yeah. So one of the things that's been a little bit curious to me as a technologist is that it feels like over the past like 5 to 20-ish years, we tend to talk about technology as though exists in a vacuum. So we'll find ourselves making comparisons about like in real life versus what happens online. It used to feel like the internet was a luxury, that smartphones were a luxury. These were entertainment devices that you could kind of choose whether or not you were going to use them. And even if that were ever true, I think we all have to admit that it's certainly not true today. So at all levels of government, technology is broadly adopted. Governments are pursuing and acquiring and deploying technology that touches all of our lives. In our work, we've taken to calling everybody a digital citizen. So whether you recognize it or not, we're all digital citizens, and we're needing to figure out what that means and how to navigate the space. So one of the things that kind of struck me in my time in the industry was that a lot of the work is carried out in a way that doesn't necessarily pay a lot of attention to the people affected. And some of this might be due to what we talked about a few minutes ago, where the services are free. So as end users, we're a bit of a sort of indirect stakeholder in the technology. But I feel like now as we're talking about technology as being so deeply embedded in our lives, we really need to think about, how people are affected. How do we be sure that broad groups are not unnecessarily harmed, that safety is a priority, and especially in, like I said, in this area where governments are pursuing and deploying technology, we have to think about what it means for citizens, for residents, for visitors to our city, and even for the public officials who are expected to take on these new roles. I think just to be candid, when I called in yesterday to the city council meeting, if I were a city council member, I wouldn't want this responsibility to have to make decisions without being prepared or without having a privacy advisory council to rely on to make recommendations for me. It's a huge call, and I think I would even say that as an expert, it's really hard to find the level of information to adequately assess what's actually happening. And if you use Twitter, find me on Twitter. I put together a couple of a little thread on a couple of relevant news stories for today. And one of them was about software engineers who are basically duped into including a specific technology as they build that had data and privacy implications that they wouldn't have expected. And so this team of researchers put together a very detailed, kind of sophisticated plan to figure out what was actually happening in terms of the data lifecycle. And it's amazing that the lengths that journalists have to go through to figure out what's actually happening. So, sorry, all that to say, city council, to put all of this, to put the weight of this responsibility on one role, I think it's really hard. So with technology, we're so excited about it. There's a lot of opportunity, but at the same time, with the great power that it brings, we've also have to recognize the great responsibility. And I'd say across the board, we all have work to do. Unfortunately, I mean, it's exciting work, but there's a lot of work to do.
Agreed. It's funny when you said, we're all digital citizens. I hear people say a lot, and this is before the pandemic, and then during it was, well, I'm not technical. But actually, like, everyone's technical now. If you're using a smartphone, you're technical, and so having an understanding of it would help. All right. So, but I want to get to San Diego specifically and the decisions that have been made in the last many years and what we've learned about. So I'm on the East Coast, and I've even heard about the smart street light fiasco. So what's going on there?
You know, for that last answer, I wouldn't quite call it a fiasco. In fact, I feel like in some ways there's a little bit of, I want to believe there's a little bit of a silver lining to it, because it put San Diego in a position to take important steps into the future in terms of this new ordinance, in terms of, establishing the Privacy Advisory Board. Maybe that's the optimist in me speaking, but all right. So what happened? So in December 2016, City Council voted to invest $30 million in smart street lights. So these are the actual lights on the streets. They're not the traffic lights. And the plan was that this technology would collect anonymized data for planning professionals, and the app developers could even use it to create new opportunities for entrepreneurship that were data-driven and data-based, addressing transit mobility problems. So even though the original intention was to, hopefully alleviate some traffic congestion downtown, alleviate parking problems, and save on energy costs, within a year, without City Council's knowledge, the smart streetlights became a surveillance tool for police. So once the police credited the use of video footage, and this was only discovered when the police credited the use of the video footage to help solve several crimes, and that's when the public became aware. So as a result, a group of privacy concerned citizens formed a nonprofit coalition that over the course of 2 years fought for San Diego to adopt some of the strongest sets of local privacy regulations in the US, which, it's quite impressive and exciting.
All right. So I apologize for fiasco. It's interesting how news travels even as quickly as it does now. By the time it gets to the East Coast, we hear different things. All right. So what could have prevented this from the first place? Because when you first described it, you said, okay, the data is going to be anonymized. What are the different things in play? What could have changed?
Right. So I would say even kind of a little bit setting aside this question of, what would be appropriate and effective oversight and accountability for this technical solution. The very first questions that could have been asked would be, why are we buying this? Like, for that amount of money, for $30 million, what is it that we're actually buying? What's this investment getting? And then, from there, figuring out, what are the list of the alleged benefits of the technology, digging into, well, how do we know that we're getting the expected features as described for that investment? I think once you start kind of spending time with technology, it becomes like, I feel like it's just clear that it doesn't always work as you would expect it to. So with some of the more data-centric technology that we have in our life, I ask people to think about how often autocorrect gets your words wrong. So you're typing on your smartphone and it's predicting what you want to enter. And before you know it, you look back to read what you've typed into the text and it's not at all what you meant. You're like, wait, what? How'd you get this from that? Like, huh? And that's a situation where, like, what you were writing, you're in direct control. You can go back and correct and edit before you hit send, and only you're seeing those mistakes. But a lot of especially when we're talking about like machine learning, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, when we're talking about things like facial recognition or sound identification of different patterns, they're probabilistic. The things that are being sold they're not perfect. They don't necessarily even work as advertised. And so I think it's really important for cities as they're looking at technology to have a way of evaluating what are you really buying? What are you expecting to get? And then from there, this is the security side of me speaking. Well, what could go wrong? So what are the adverse events that could arise due to the deployment of this technology? I think it's one thing to say that it works for certain cases, but what are the different things that could happen here? And then now to turn to talking about oversight. So what are the ongoing indicators that we could observe that would allow us to evaluate and be assured that we're getting what we paid for? Again, on oversight, how do we know that there aren't bonus features? So for the smart city streetlights, a lot of the basic features that the city thought it was getting into, turning on the light to the right level, power saving, being able to have new data sources that entrepreneurs could build on top of, that all sounds great. But from the FOIA, the information that was disclosed based on records requests, it seems like it wasn't necessarily brought to folks' attention that those features were supported by ongoing video camera footage plus audio. And once that information is collected, just by nature of how the technology is implemented, storage is cheap, these devices are connected to the internet, like a lot more could happen. There's a lot of possibility there. So how do you, and so this is what I say, it's how do you be sure there aren't bonus features, that you're not getting kind of almost an infomercial version of, but wait, there's more. You don't want those surprises. And then for accountability. So if an adverse event does occur, which with technology, I mean, I joke that one of the first things that you learn in CS education is if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. So you test, right? It's just classic Murphy's Law. So if something does occur, how will we make sure that the affected parties could be made whole again? How do you fix it? How do you redress what's happened? And then in terms of resilience, if these events occur, what are options for adapting the deployment so it doesn't happen again? So at least from my perspective, if I were in a decision-making position where I'm debating whether or not to deploy a technology, without access to this information, I don't know how you could say yes, especially on the behalf of so many people.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you're doing a retrospective to see what went wrong or what didn't wrong. But that's just like one case. What about other technologies that, I mean, government's procuring this all the time in deploying, there are drones, automatic license plate readers. In New York City, there is this huge list, and some is controlled by the state, and some is controlled by the federal. Like, it's crazy. So what do people need to know about other technologies?
Yeah, and here I want to be careful. I think I've been maybe mixing the message between kind of all of the inherent technical detail and what's behind the things, the technology that we're deploying, while also saying you don't need to be an expert in all of these things to ask questions and have reasonable expectations of them. So what I want to anchor on is that, like, when we're talking about specific problems and specific solutions, and thinking about whether or not, so for example, like, does the city want to use a gunshot detection software tool to figure out, or I guess to improve public safety? It's like, what is the goal, and does this particular tool actually get us to the goal? Also in the context of all of our goals. I think it's really hard, or maybe I think it's easy to make sort of the wrong decision, or kind of one that's not helpful if you're not taking in the broader context. And the implementation details, they really matter. So a wonderful thing about hardware and software is that you can achieve your results in a myriad of ways. So the features that make security and technology so exciting, unfortunately, they tend to be the same features that make it so hard to get right and so worrisome. So when I'm thinking about something like the smart streetlights, we have new physical hardware that's installed in the streets, new video cameras, new microphones. On that device, there's software that can do different things. They're connected to the internet. Once you have that set up, the company that's administering it, they can make changes on the whim, like on their own whim, basically. So if you think about like the devices in your house, when they have software updates, they're getting new instructions to run. And you want to be sure that you trust the company or the organization that's putting the instructions on them. Otherwise, they're maybe doing unexpected things. And really, I think one of the things too about technology is that we're always excited about like the scale, the opportunity to do things. One click and many things happen. It's exciting. They happen quickly and they can happen over time. So when we talk about things like Jones's first responders in the city of Chula Vista, you could think about the upsides and you could kind of understand the appeal. If you're law enforcement, you're thinking about like, okay, if we have a drone that we can send into a dangerous situation, well, that means that our force is protected. It means we can get there quickly. It means we don't have to deal with traffic. We don't have to deal with, a lot of things. But then as a technologist, like I said, the implementation details really matter about whether or not this is a good idea. So I'm curiously looking out for how tech is positioned and how it's described, the promises that are made in terms of security, privacy, and data protection, and the policies that are operationalizing those promises, and even the technical mechanisms behind the enforcement policies. So how are they enforced? On some aspects, these decisions can be tough to make. It's hard to figure out how do you move from the promises that people want to hear to the technical ability to make that happen. And you have kind of big questions like from the drones work by having video cameras. A lot of them have microphones on them. So when you have those feeds of data, how long do you keep it? Who should have access to it? Under what conditions? And what are the potential harms that could occur from the use of it? And sometimes you'll see knee-jerk reactions to these questions. Some of them, the company will provide answers to them that are more marketing than truth. And as an expert, when I look at these, what I'm looking for are the promises that I know that companies are making promises that they know people want to hear, and the companies want to make them, but sometimes they can't actually live up to them. So some of these include words like, this is 100% secure. This is 100% private. This is 100% safe. The data is anonymous. I think I saw a claim that the drone footage is anonymous. That's literally impossible. It just doesn't make sense. These are video camera things. With the advent of other technology, it's like these drones aren't being used in a vacuum. Facial recognition, things like Clearview AI exist. Like there is a way to make pairings between data that's being collected, and it's these claims can't be made even as much as we want them to be. Trusted is another one that I think can sometimes be a big red flag. From what we've been talking about, I don't think that there's adequate evidence available to anybody outside of the companies that could actually claim that something could be trusted. It's just too hard. Another interesting one that is kind of a big red flag is military grade security. It's one of these interesting terms that doesn't really have any meaning. So these are the things that I sort of look for.
All right, you're using a lot of phrasing from relationship language, and trust keeps coming up a lot, right? Okay, so what can we do? I'm gonna actually combine two questions here. So what can we do to build trust? And then I'm gonna bring up something. Congressman Ro Khanna was on Kara Swisher's podcast recently on Sway in the New York Times. And she was asking him a lot of the stuff we're talking about. And he said, look, I don't get calls into my office about privacy laws. Quote, people have to say, this is not about tech, this is about our democracy, this is about our economy. And if we get to that point, then we can start the reform. So, what can we do? And will calling an official make a difference?
Yeah, I feel like our elected officials really need to hear on the topic. So I feel like from everything that we've talked about tonight, to fix the way that data is used by these various products, by surveillance equipment, it's going to take an enormous concerted effort. So as an academic, I work to prepare students to think about taking into account these considerations about what are the adverse effects, how are different populations affected, and how do we mitigate them and build things differently. As a computer scientist, I help to fix industry's broken practices. And as a privacy expert, I'm lending my expertise to advise on possible regulations for the future. I think the missing piece right now is helping everybody, regular people, learn more about how their data is being used and what they can do about it, and getting folks kind of curious and interested enough to actually make those calls so that elected officials know that the adoption of these technologies, I think it's sometimes treated as an inevitability, almost as sort of like manifest destiny and technology, that this is the future is here, you just accept it. And I think we should all reject that. It's people build these things, people make decisions to deploy them. We could all choose for it to be a different way. So I do really feel that for as long as technology feels magical, and for as long as people feel like they're disempowered and don't have a place in the conversation, maybe things would go a different way, but I feel like we could fix it, and I really want to fix that. So, and I think events like this one help.
I read recently one of the calls to action could be like treat software like a public good. So if a government is procuring software, they should open it up and let everyone evaluate it. It's easy to do. It's easy to share. Get comments on it. And a lot of the software we're procuring is proprietary, so we can't see under the hood. We don't actually know what it's doing. There are lots of people that could look under the hood for us. But if we don't let our elected officials know that that's something that could be done, we wouldn't know. All right, so it's hard to read like a little bit how optimistic and how pessimistic you are. So where are you?
Yeah, I'm excited and optimistic. It feels like, for the first time in my career, that there are more voices at the table. There's kind of a growing conversation about this. Like there are a lot of nonprofits that are focused on the impact of technology on society, and there are funders out there supporting them. Colleges and universities are reinvesting in the humanities and thinking about how do we move into this space where technology is a core part of our lives, where we're all digital citizens. And it feels like companies are actually under fire for the bad data practices. Increasingly, we're seeing a good number of journalists, I think, who are really bringing these issues out. I mean, also, if it's okay to plug the League of Women Voters surveillance report, like you could read through all of the different technologies that are deployed in our area and the issues at hand. This level of critical assessment and pushing back to say, we have values that we want to see prioritized in our communities, and surveillance technology doesn't support that. I think it's a really important conversation for us all to have. So I'm hopeful. I'm definitely hopeful about the direction that things are taking.
All right, good. That means I can sleep tonight. Yeah, there are lots of angles to responsible tech, right? There's like the labor issues, licensing of software, the economics of it. But I think you're like the fact that there are nonprofits focused on this, colleges and universities and higher ed institutions teaching this to students like you are at University of San Diego, and funders like my former employee, we used to fund this stuff. So there's a lot of interest, and the fact that we're having this conversation tonight. Okay, so that's the end of our prepared questions. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you both. Very, very interesting topic that we could probably talk about every different angle in much greater detail, aside from private use of data and collection versus government use. But and we have a number of questions that have come in, but could I ask you to just give a summary? I think Maritiza, maybe both of you, for those people who may not have heard some of these terminologies or be even familiar with some of these technologies before, can you give us an overview, a little brief description of what some of the things are being used by government and in particular police? You've mentioned, and we've talked about ShotSpotter and smart street lights and drones, and I think license plate readers are some of those. So I'm guessing that we have people in our audience who might be really surprised to know some of these things are being used and what they are and what information they're gathering. Could you just give us a brief overview of that, and we'll then dig into some more detailed questions.
Yeah, so we have ShotSpotter, smart street lights, automatic license plate readers, and what did you say, a fourth one?
I think drones.
And the drones, right?
Pretty straightforward, yeah.
Yeah. So I would summarize these different technologies as being examples of new things that are available based on sort of the increasing cheapness and availability of internet everywhere, small video cameras, the ability to use audio data, and to make that mobile. So I'm thinking first of like a drone. So drones are, these little computers that fly through the air that are basically like really advanced remote control helicopters that you throw up. And they fly through the air, and they're using technological sensors to make sense of the environment, and then to stream that, to send it back to law enforcement so that they can use it as their eyes and ears. And a thing that is, I think, underappreciated, as we talked about earlier in this call about the data life cycle, is that the eyes and ears on these devices don't work like our eyes and ears. They're, perfect records of high fidelity data that you can zoom in on. And we should all have a lot of questions about how that video footage is used and how's the audio used. Like basically, where does the data go once it's collected? So drones are using this style of data for automatic license plate readers. They're also relying on video cameras. I would assume that they're not using a microphone to, like, you wouldn't need a microphone to read and identify a license plate. For the smart city streetlights, the basic functionality of that was that, again, these are streetlights, they're not the traffic lights, that a streetlight post would use a video camera to determine, based on weather conditions, how much, what level of brightness to set the light to. And just by virtue of a video camera being used to offer that feature, a lot more can be done with video footage than merely determining how bright is it outside. And here's where you get the secondary effects that we've seen in the city of San Diego, where law enforcement sees it as an opportunity to have surveillance footage of the areas that these are deployed. What was the other one? And ShotSpotter. So ShotSpotter is an audio-based technology that is essentially putting live microphones in an area of interest in order to detect whether or not loud sounds that are heard are actually gunshot sounds. And so this would be taking a recording from the area, a sampling of the ambient sound, and then matching that to, I guess, a bunch of recordings of what gunshots sound like to try to figure out, is this backfire from a car, or is this a gunshot? And yeah, so these are the sort of things that are at hand.
So just to follow up, Jeannie, and then so private companies are going in and installing, in the case, for example, of ShotSpotter, they're installing microphones somewhere, gathering that data and then feeding it to law enforcement. So given those kinds of technologies that are out there, what kind of adverse events with these sorts of surveillance mechanisms should we be most alert to and concerned about in San Diego?
Yeah. Maybe you could kind of tell in the way that I answered the question of grouping these technologies by the way that data is collected and pursued in terms of video or audio. I think all of these technologies are concerning and need to be watched. Oversight and accountability is needed in terms of our expectation for whether or not these technologies have been built safely in a way that could be deployed within a city. Based on my knowledge of the information that's been made available, I feel like that's not what we're seeing right now. As I'm kind of looking forward to there being more scrutiny and a higher expectation of the information that's made available to a broader public before we could really make these determinations of, are these technologies safe? To talk specifically about, so ShotSpotter has received a good amount of coverage and interrogation by journalists in terms of its use, the deployment, the cost, the effectiveness, the adverse events. And I feel like looking at all the evidence, it's really hard to come down on the side of it being worth it. It doesn't actually work. Like there's a lot of evidence that shows it just doesn't work. So if you look at the cost and you look at, but not just the monetary cost, but the effects of the ways that humans respond to being under surveillance, it's hard to argue that that's worth it. So, and then I think, if it did work, what would the conversation be? And for me, it would be, well, what are the protections that are put into place so that we know that these hot mics that are being deployed at various points of the city aren't being misused? I feel like these are questions that are, when they're raised, it feels like the decision makers who are responsible go back to almost demanding blind trust. And to me, that raises more questions. Like, why are you so defensive about this?
Okay, great, thank you. Jamie?
Yeah, Ann Noel has asked, could you explain why the gathering of medical data is so useful or important? And with the HIPAA laws, is this to do with the malpractice insurance or patient protection, as in the Henrietta Lack story, or other thoughts about medical data being used?
Mhm. Oh, this is a very big question. So why is the gathering of medical data so useful and so important? I think, right now we're in a situation where healthcare alongside many other sectors is seeing a huge kind of boon in advances due to technology and the uses of data. And so on the one side, it's very exciting and a lot could be done. But then on the other side, with I think both the realities of our insurance system within the US and also just the potential for, I guess also the disparities in care that we see based off of socioeconomic status and racial factors, I think it's a tough environment to be in with thinking about how is this data going to be used? How will different stakeholders see it? Can I know for sure that this data is not going to be used against me personally, or even in a way that disadvantages a group that I may be a part of? I feel like HIPAA laws need to be updated. So, in that earlier kind of answer where I talked about the different hot words that help me as an expert know that maybe something fishy is going on, when I see a claim that something is private because no PII has been collected. PII is a term of art from HIPAA, which is personally identifiable information. And it's limited to just like 11 things. It's like your name, your address, your phone number. I can't remember the others. Or then just last weekend, I was talking with somebody who works in medical research, and she was telling me that one of their core data sources are MRI images. So when I told her I work in privacy, she's like, wow, with my MRI data, folks are always asking me, is it anonymized? Is it de-identified? And she's like, the thing is, it's your face. Like it's the structure of it's you. Like if we de-identify it, we lose data. So I feel like a thing that's hard about medical data is the more you protect it, the more you make changes to it so that you can make these claims, the less useful it becomes. So sorry, that's a long-winded answer for a complicated question.
Do you think it matters that medical professionals often, they have to take courses in ethics? Like this is part of their training, whereas our colleagues at these companies we worked with did not take, there weren't ethical courses we had to take in school.
Mm-hmm. It's a great point. I think one of the things that's been missing from our profession is this idea of, agreeing to a Hippocratic oath, accepting a duty of care, and really living up to that. It's something I would love to see. I think we would all benefit from it.
To follow up a little bit on that, in healthcare, as I understand it, if those HIPAA regulations are violated, there's legal recourse for that. Is there any legal challenges or recourse to the misuse of the data that's being collected by police or other government agencies that you're aware of? And should there be? I guess
yeah,
that question.
It's a great question, and I'm surprised that for the first time in an hour, I'll say I'm not a lawyer, so I can't advise for certain. But I do want to say that my gut reaction would be that in the U.S., at least in the state of California, we have data breach laws. So that's probably one of the strongest things that we have in terms of learning that something has happened related to our data. But probably everybody on this call has received one of those mailers that says your health records have been inappropriately accessed. Your social security number was part of this breach. When Equifax was hacked, millions of people got a notice for that. And what happened there? I think Equifax offered everybody affected a year of their own identity theft monitoring program. You're kind of like, gee, thanks, Equifax. So there's definitely room for improvement.
I'd read recently that GDPR, the privacy and data regulations in Europe, it's almost like 5 years old, and it's very, very difficult to enforce. And the tech companies, the phrase I heard is they're running circles around it. The fines are not that big of a deal. And in the US, different states are coming up with their own policies, and that's very difficult to enforce. And in fact, we should call on the federal level to come up with a national wide to work closely with GDPR, because technology knows no boundaries, and so the more states that pop up with these regulations, the more difficult it is to enforce.
Jeannie, do you have a question?
All right. Yes. One of our listeners said that our local police department has been using automated license plate reading technology for some time, sharing data with ICE, and in spite of objections by residents. City staff have indicated that they're willing to discuss some guardrails for the program, but that discontinuing the program is off the table. Is this an acceptable response given concerns of local residents? And what guardrails, if any, would be effective in addressing these concerns?
I guess I've said it before, it's a really good question. When you think about automatic license plate readers as a technology and the ways it could be used, in some cases, different cities will use them for, red light cameras and following up with a ticket. And that's a different conversation than taking the same technology and collecting the data and sharing it with searching kind of this broad dragnet surveillance of using a screening technology to see if who's passing through the area, and then even collecting and saving that data for any stretch of time so that you could then go back and see who was in the area. I think a lot of license plate readers are definitely a situation where the implementation details matter a lot, and being able to have appropriate oversight and accountability for understanding both not just what the implementation is, but then in practice how the data has been used. I think it's very telling that with deployment in Chula Vista, it was almost, I want to say it was discovered by accident that the license plate reader data was being made available to ICE. It seemed as though folks within Chula Vista didn't really know that that was happening. That's a situation that should never occur. A group should not be, or a government agency shouldn't be deploying technology where they don't understand where the data is going. So then at least one guardrail would be, if you're going to deploy the data, be sure that it stays local. But I think there are big questions to ask about whether or not this is a technology that belongs in a city where the value is. We're a welcoming city. These two things are, it's tough to reconcile.
Marissa, why don't they just throw the data out? License plate readers, all right, if they didn't run the red light, throw that data away. Why isn't that a guardrail or a solution?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not having the data is a great way to say that makes it clear that you're not using it for, I was joking about these, bonus features. But I think unfortunately that's not usually what's happening.
This is a little bit different tack. We'll come back. We have some more government related questions, but somebody's asked about free email accounts and how safe email is in regard to data privacy, and would paying for an email account give you more security and privacy?
Yeah. The answer for most of the work that I do is always, it depends. So it really depends on the email provider. There are some email providers where you pay money for the service, and that means that you get stronger guarantees about both security and privacy and how that data is used. A contrast would be when you use a Gmail email address, they're scanning it and figuring out what ads they can place in your inbox, and also scanning. I want to say that they've been scanning your emails to figure out what you buy from Amazon and your receipts to put you in different ad targeting groups. The reason I say that it depends is that I know a friend up at Berkeley has done some research between free apps and paid mobile apps. There's an assumption that if you pay for a mobile app, you get the ad-free version, and that less of your data is collected and less of it is used, so that you're getting more privacy. But they've done research that shows that that's not actually the case. And I think this is a situation where, like, that's clearly not what anybody, no reasonable person would expect that if you're paying for an ad-free version. So stronger regulations and calling our representatives to demand, I think, better protections is needed in these cases.
Maritza, what about browsers? So, like, okay, email is one thing, but now there are browsers out there. A lot of people use Chrome. Like if you open Safari, it says, we've prevented whatever this from happening to you. Mozilla is a nonprofit that's been operating for a long time, hailing privacy and protecting the user first. So if you use a more protected browser, does that make a difference?
Yeah, that definitely makes a difference. So I think one of the things in terms of like, what can you individually do, be mindful of the different services that you're using, and when an option comes out that's offering some privacy protection, check it out. Turn it on, enable it, see if it works for you, see if you can still go about getting the features that you're relying on, while hopefully having less of your data collected or shared or used in different ways. Yeah, like Jessica mentioned, the Brave browser is a great example of one that's coming out that is more privacy protective than ones that we've seen. I think unfortunately over like the past 10 years, Chrome has become, it's just kind of entrenched in the business model of Google. And I think here's where, with the class that I teach, I ask students to kind of think hard about the business model for the companies behind the products that we're using. And Google, just like Facebook, we're used to thinking of them as a search engine, but they're really an advertising company. And lots of decisions followed from that.
So in other words, they make their money by scanning through the emails and selling that data and sending that off to data aggregators and whomever else would be using it. Yeah. And I don't know if a lot of people are aware of that. So that's a really helpful comment. Let's see, I've got a couple here. Jeannie, do you have one?
Yeah, I've got one. The San Diego Union Tribune editorial board recently conducted a video interview of ShotSpotter company reps that was posted online, and it was essentially letting the public watch a surveillance tech vendor's sales pitch and claims for their product. That seems like an extremely rare and valuable method for community oversight. Any thoughts about whether that could be used? If you saw that sort of video, or in general, what you think about being able to get a video of what they're telling it will do, what they're saying it will do.
Yeah, I mean, in the absence of meaningful transparency that would allow us to have oversight and accountability, looking out at the marketing materials, I think, is a great way to have a basis for starting to formulate our questions, right? Like when you're looking at the features that they're selling, you can start asking questions like, well, wait, but like what data do you collect that makes that possible? Or, how do you measure whether or not it's effective? What are the like the mislabeled events that are happening here? I think it's a great kind of like source of information where you can start to see how something is talked about when it's being pitched to a particular stakeholder. There's a researcher that I follow on Twitter. His name's Jack Polson. I think he recently got kicked out of a law enforcement conference for videotaping vendor pitches. And he heard some really interesting things like this, it was kind of I always think it's interesting, like who is telling us that privacy is dead, because they tend to be the companies that also want to like eagerly protect their own secrets and don't want, you know, somebody sitting around with a video camera publishing it to the internet. It's a very like that's always a curious situation.
That's interesting because Apple, all right, Apple says, all right, we're doing privacy, and a lot of people look to Apple as like, okay, well, you know, they're taking some stance on privacy. Are there companies that are doing it well, in your opinion?
You know, up until Apple announced that they would be scanning folks' phones looking for, you know, certain illegal activities, I would have said Apple. I think there's just personally, like I use a lot of Apple devices, and I have one of the smart home speakers in our living room. My kids love it, of course. And but at the same time, I feel like this is why I talk about privacy in terms of a relationship and in terms of trust. Like Apple, up until they announced that they were going to be that they were building and maybe even soon releasing that feature, I trusted them a great deal, and I believe them when I said that, you know, at their company they believe privacy is a fundamental human right and that they prioritize it. But based off of the way that they were going about building that feature, the trust is diminished. It's
So, you know, another factor to look at with a lot of companies is where they're putting their money for lobbying. Apple has put almost the same amount of money in lobbying against privacy regulations as Facebook has.
Yeah.
So looking at how they're spending.
Yeah, it's a great, yes, definitely look at where companies are spending their lobbying money. And I mean, it's hard because I feel like I just gave all of you a bunch of homework and a lot to think about. Unfortunately, like these are things where it's like the thing that we all need to do is just get really curious and start, you know, keep this conversation going, ask a lot of questions, start wondering about things, and I think really not worrying about not knowing the answer. That's sort of the usability expert in me. It's never the fault of the user for incorrectly using a thing. It's the fault of the designer for building something that couldn't be used correctly. And that's how I feel about a lot of this technology. It's not our fault that we don't understand. They are at times deliberately built so that we can't really get a grasp on what's happening.
What nonprofits are working most effectively on that issue? Speaking of educating and lobbying for different regulations.
Yeah, so we have, you know, the two big ones that come to mind are the EFF, so the Electronic Freedom Foundation, and then also the ACLU. Increasingly, I think the other one that comes to mind is Access Now in terms of internet issues. Jessica, have I missed any big ones?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say those are great for advocacy groups. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has been around a while, and they have an incredible combination of like people that are very technical and lawyers that are teaming up. On the technical side, though, I want to tout Mozilla again. Mozilla is a nonprofit. They have a browser, Firefox, and they run a nonprofit off of that. And the nonprofit has a whole arm on data stewardship. And their position is people should just toss the data or be very, very open about it. There are other groups like All Tech is Human, which is trying to bring people that are in technical fields together to start asking questions within their own work environments. But yeah, I've been very impressed with like the ACLU's efforts on this, especially partnering with like local nonprofits, local meaning, you know, like state and community level organizations.
Yes, just want to say that our committee has had speakers from the ACLU and EFF. So I'll have to look at All Tech is Human as well.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether this has been answered already. The Patriot Act was written before much of this technology was developed and allows law enforcement at all levels to share data. The result now is that ICE is using it to arrest and deport people of color, which is often inappropriate. Should there be limits on the sharing of law enforcement technology so it doesn't get out of hand?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if we think about how much has changed in terms of technology since 2001, 2002, when I started to talk about these 4 different technologies that have been deployed in San Diego and Chula Vista, there've been some technological advances that really make all of these possible in ways that they wouldn't have been before, and also far more potent. So even if you think about like our personal technologies, like everybody is constantly carrying around a smartphone. The power in these computers is absurd compared to like this smartphone is more powerful than the laptop that I bought as a freshman at USD in 2002 by like leaps and bounds. It's crazy. And it's always connected to the internet. It's, it's capable of doing so much. So yeah, like it's, we should be rethinking most of our technology-based regulations and thinking about how we adequately preserve what's worth preserving without giving up too much.
Again, I'll do my call for approaching software like a public good. If you are using software that you being the government is using software that involves personal data, or even not, just any kind of software that's procured from an external vendor, publish the code, put it out there, let the community speak about it before procuring and deploying.
A question that came in a little bit ago, and I'm sorry I overlooked it. We might be looping back a little bit, but a question about how frequently and how police are using facial recognition systems. Is that part of the other technology we talked about with the drones and so forth, or is that also a separate category?
Facial recognition gets interesting because this is the technology that you can basically use on top of any data where you have video footage. And so, I feel like we right now, we can't really know whether or not facial recognition is being used and where it's being used and when. If you look at companies, so actually when we're talking about like nonprofits that are doing a good job of educating and educating people in the space, I think that journalists are doing a lot of the hard work in terms of raising issues, identifying problems, and educating the public. So if you look at publications like The Markup by Julia Angwin, and then also like at Voice of San Diego, Jesse Marks, they've written about Clearview AI, and this is a super small company that is basically taken like kind of gone ahead and collected a huge amount of photos from across the internet, combining basically every photo they could get their hands on off of the public internet to train facial recognition models and then sell the technology to government agencies. And the company is worth quite a lot of money, so they must have a good number of customers. And from journalist reports, we're figuring, like, we're finding out who Clearview AI's customers are. And so that doesn't tell us when and how it's being used, but if it's being paid for, somebody's using it for something. And it's worrisome. I think this is where it's from a perspective of privacy, there are people who want to focus the conversation on, well, when is data collected? When is it public? If it's public, does that just mean that we could use it? And then would want to argue that Clearview AI is just use of public data. What's the problem? But I feel like facial recognition, there's a huge conversation here. And even going back to my earlier question, it doesn't always work. So there's a great documentary called Coded Bias that demonstrated that a lot of facial recognition tech doesn't work for people who have darker skin tones. And that's a problem. So Kashmir Hill at the New York Times has reported on, at least 2 men who have gone to jail because of faulty facial recognition. the technology can't be used, or it shouldn't be used if it doesn't work. And even if it did work, I think there are big questions about whether or not it should be used based on how it's built and used. So yeah, unfortunately, it could be added to a feature for any video data you might have.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. I had a question come in, Jessica. Could you explain a little bit more? You mentioned GDPR and what that is and how we might use that. I think you indicated as a model or at least a starting point here, but could you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. I can't even remember what it stands for, Marissa can say, but it's an omnibus privacy law in the European Union that basically it says, don't collect the data unless you need it. If you collect it, then tell everyone how you're using it and then ditch it as soon as you can. And that's it. It's treating data as very toxic and it's putting the user first. It's a great start. It's something that we can model on, but there are a lot of limitations to it, which Marissa can elaborate on.
Yeah, so one of the nice things, it's the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's so in Europe, the privacy conversation tends to be very human rights focused, and so GDPR, it codifies that and then gives individuals, you have rights by being a user, and companies have to provide you with features that allow you to act on your rights in terms of being able to, for example, like request a record of all of the data that a company has about you. Or if you ask them to delete your data, they actually have to delete your data. Actually, the state of California is further out ahead than the rest of the US in terms of privacy regulations. So we have CCPA and also CPRA, which I'm sorry, I can't remember what those acronyms expand to right now. But CPRA is basically sort of California's take on a GDPR-like law, putting people first. A lot of these laws tend to have, I think, carve-outs for government's use of data. They're, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I'd say they're kind of cleverly written to allow certain things to continue to happen. But like some of these technologies we've talked about, like ShotSpotter and actually don't know the names of the companies for, I can't remember the company for like the smart street lights, but like those are just kind of companies out there building things that are available on the free market. They're not technologies that are built specifically under a government contract. So I assume these companies would be responsible for complying with CPRA and other regulations that give California's residents data rights that you can act on.
All those choices we have to opt out when we get those messages when we go to a new website. And some are easier than others. Some you just think, oh my goodness, it's so hard to follow that through. So, but I try all the time. See, Jeannie, do you see anything else? I think
Yeah, well, there was one that, are there any California state laws that you might, that we might support? I mean, you just mentioned the CCPA and RA, but are there any legislation that's coming up that you know of?
Oh, no, I actually don't know.
Okay, that's a fair answer.
Good follow-up for that.
Yes.
I think we've covered all the questions. Jeannie, do you want to wrap it up? And this is leading us into some important meetings next week. So, Jeannie.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both very much for this important information. Let's all give a little applaud to our speakers. And I want to thank the audience for their attention. By attending, you have shown that you care about our constitutional rights for privacy. And I hope that all league members will be attending the April 14th meeting, where we will be sharing the results of our policing study and coming to consensus on some positions. So look at either of our websites for them more information or to register for those meetings. Please register ahead of time. And again, thank you, Jessica and Maritiza. We really appreciated your vast knowledge.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yeah.